February 11th, 1941. A sealed envelope sat on the kitchen table in Bærum, Norway. Inside, 23 lines accusing the head of the Nazi-installed government of treason. The envelope bore a woman's name in clear ink, Ingrid Bjerkås, housewife, mother of 3. Mailing that letter would place her name on a list most people never came back from. If intercepted, it would confirm her as an enemy of the occupation. If it reached Vidkun Quisling's desk, it would mark her as someone who refused to pretend. That single sheet of paper and the choice to send it would set in motion 2 decades of condemnation, first by a regime that wanted her silent, then by a church that wanted her invisible. Our story follows a woman whose defiance took 2 forms, one in wartime, when standing against tyranny could cost you your life, and one in peacetime, when standing for equality could cost you your calling. Ingrid Bjerkås is not a household name. She did not blow up railway lines or smuggle refugees across the Swedish border. What she did was simpler and in some ways more dangerous. She signed her own name to written dissent at a time when anonymity was survival. Then, after the occupation ended, she did it again, this time not against Nazis, but against the religious establishment that told her a woman could not stand at the altar. The cost of both choices would follow her until her death. This is the story of how one person's courage became evidence against her twice. Her father was a school principal. Her mother ran the household with the quiet authority of someone who knew that education and faith were the only inheritances that mattered. Ingrid absorbed both. She was bright, serious, more interested in books than gossip. By the time she was 20, she had trained as a teacher and married a man named Arne Bjerkås, a civil servant with steady work and quiet convictions. They settled in Bærum, a suburb west of Oslo, and had 3 children by the early 1930s. Life was predictable: church on Sundays, school meetings during the week, summers by the fjord. Predictable, at least, until the day addresses started changing without anyone moving. Ingrid taught part-time and kept the household running with the precision of someone who had learned early that small things, clean floors, packed lunches, bedtime prayers were the scaffolding that held a family upright. She had no idea that same precision would one day keep her alive in a place where order was the difference between surviving and disappearing. At the time, Ingrid still believed the worst thing that could happen was being questioned. She was wrong. Then April 9, 1940 arrived, and the scaffolding cracked. German forces invaded Norway in a coordinated assault that took Oslo, Narvik, Trondheim, and Bergen in a single day. The Norwegian government fled north, then into exile in London. King Håkon VII refused to appoint Vidkun Quisling, the leader of Norway's fascist National Samling Party, as prime minister. Quisling declared himself head of government anyway, backed by German guns. By the summer of 1940, Norway was under occupation, its military defeated, its government scattered, its people navigating the slow suffocation of totalitarian control. But close to Oslo became a nerve center for Nazi administration. German officers requisitioned homes. Norwegian collaborators moved into positions of power. The red banners with the black swastika hung from municipal buildings like a second flag. Ingrid watched her neighbors make their choices. Some joined National Samling, believing Norway's future lay in cooperation with the new order. Others withdrew into silence, heads down, mouths shut. A few began to resist. Small acts at first, hiding radios, passing along BBC broadcasts, quietly helping families whose breadwinners had been arrested. Ingrid did not join a formal resistance cell. She did not have access to weapons or codes or underground networks. What she had was a typewriter, a stack of paper, and a conviction that silence was complicity. In the winter of 1941, she wrote a letter to Vidkun Quisling. The letter did not mince words. It accused him of betraying Norway, of serving foreign masters, of using collaboration as a mask for ambition. She typed it carefully, checked the spelling, folded it into an envelope, and wrote his name on the front. Then she pressed the envelope with her thumb, as if to seal not just the paper but her resolve. She mailed it from a local post office on a gray afternoon. No one saw her do it. No one had to. What she didn't know was that the envelope would be opened twice, once by the regime, and years later by a different kind of authority. The letter reached Quisling's office. Whether he read it himself or whether it was filed by an assistant is unclear. What is certain is that Ingrid's name entered the records. A housewife in Bærum had sent a direct accusation to the head of the collaborationist government. That was noted. That was remembered. 2 years passed. Ingrid continued teaching, raising her children, attending church. The occupation deepened. Rationing grew tighter. The Gestapo expanded its network of informers. In the autumn of 1943, the University of Oslo became a flashpoint. Students and professors had been quietly resisting Nazi indoctrination. On November 30, a fire broke out on campus. The Nazis blamed students and launched a crackdown. Hundreds of male students were arrested, interrogated, and deported to camps in Germany. The university was shut down. The purge sent a message: intellectual resistance would be crushed just as violently as armed resistance. Ingrid, who had once dreamed of university herself, could not stay silent. She wrote a second letter. This one protested the arrests, condemned the targeting of Norway's young people, and demanded accountability. She signed it. She mailed it. The envelope bore the same careful seal, the same clear handwriting. This time, the authorities noticed. In early 1944, Ingrid Bjerkås was arrested. The Gestapo did not need to torture her. They had the letters, her name, her words, her signature, all of it on file. She was taken to Grini, a detention camp northwest of Oslo that served as a holding pen for political prisoners. Grini was not Auschwitz. It was not a death camp. But it was a place where people disappeared into bureaucracy, where interrogations could stretch for weeks, and where the line between temporary detention and permanent deportation was as thin as a stamped document. Ingrid spent months there. The cold was relentless. The food was thin gruel and stale bread. The guards were Norwegian collaborators and German overseers who treated prisoners like inventory names on a list, problems to be managed. She was questioned repeatedly. To identify fellow dissidents, to confess to being part of a larger network. She had no network to confess. She had acted alone. That was the truth, and it saved her. A network could be dismantled. A lone writer was just a stubborn woman. Eventually, after months of cold and questions and sleepless nights, she was released. No trial, no formal charge, just a notation in a file and a warning. One more letter and the outcome would be different. Ingrid returned to Bærum in the spring of 1944. The house was as she had left it, but she was not. Her children had grown older without her. Her husband had aged in ways that had nothing to do with time. The neighbors who had seen her arrested now greeted her with cautious nods, some in solidarity, others in fear that association might bring scrutiny. Ingrid resumed her routines. She cooked. She cleaned. She went to church. But something inside her had shifted. The envelope she had sealed twice had become a kind of evidence, not just against her in the Nazi files, but within her own mind. Proof that words mattered, that naming injustice out loud was a form of testimony even when it led to punishment. She had signed her name to truth twice, and twice it had cost her. She would do it again. The war ended in May 1945. Liberation came with church bells and tears, and the return of King Haakon. But the aftermath was messy. Collaborators were tried. Resistance heroes were celebrated. Ingrid, who had neither fought with guns nor carried secrets across borders, was neither. She was a woman who had written letters. That was not cinematic enough for monuments. It was not dramatic enough for medals. It was just what she had done. She went back to teaching. She attended church every Sunday. And then, in her mid-40s, she made a decision that startled everyone who knew her. She enrolled in theology studies. Not as a hobby, not as a pastime for a middle-aged housewife. She wanted to become a minister. The Church of Norway had never ordained a woman. The theological justification was centuries old. Women could teach children, could organize charity, could serve in every capacity except the one that mattered. Standing at the altar, consecrating the Eucharist, speaking with the authority of ordination. Ingrid did not see it that way. She saw no scriptural barrier. She saw tradition, yes, but not divine law. She studied at the Norwegian School of Theology in Oslo, commuting from Bærum, sitting in lectures with men half her age. Some professors admired her tenacity. Others treated her like an anomaly, a curiosity. She completed her degree in 1960. Then she applied for ordination. The church said no. She applied again. They said no again. The debate went public. Newspapers ran editorials. Church leaders argued that ordaining women would violate apostolic tradition, that it would fracture unity with other Lutheran bodies, that it would confuse the faithful. Supporters pointed to other Protestant denominations that had already ordained women. The argument was not just theological, it was political, cultural, deeply personal. Ingrid, who had once faced the Gestapo in Grini, now faced bishops who refused to meet her eyes. Finally, on March 1961, in Vang Church in Hamar, Ingrid Bjerkås was ordained as the first woman minister in the Church of Norway. The ceremony was brief. The bishop who performed the ordination did so under protest from his peers. Some clergy refused to attend. Some parishioners walked out. Ingrid stood in her black robe, her stole draped over her shoulders, and spoke the words of the ordination vow. Her hands, which had once sealed envelopes addressed to a collaborationist dictator, now held the chalice. The same courage, the same defiance, just a different uniform. The years that followed were not easy. Ingrid was appointed to a parish, but many congregants refused to accept her. Some walked out during her sermons. Others demanded that male colleagues administer communion instead. Bishops in other dioceses refused to recognize her ordination. The church that had once been her refuge became a battlefield. She preached anyway. She visited the sick, she buried the dead. She did the work of ministry with the same quiet stubbornness that had carried her through Grini. The envelope, the seal she had pressed twice in wartime, had become something larger, a symbol of her willingness to sign her name to unpopular truth, whether the enemy was a Nazi puppet or a church hierarchy that wanted her silent. Ingrid Bjerkås died in 1965, just 4 years after her ordination. She was 63. The cause was cancer, which had been quietly advancing through her body even as she fought her public battles. Her funeral was small. The church was not full. Some clergy attended. Others stayed away. The obituaries were polite but brief. She had been the first woman minister in Norway, yes, but the church had already moved on to debating whether to ordain more. Her name, which had once appeared on Gestapo files and ordination records, faded into the margins of history. No statues were erected. No schools were named after her. She became a footnote in the story of women's ordination, mentioned in passing, rarely examined in depth. But here is what the history books often miss. Ingrid Bjerkås was condemned twice, and both times for the same reason: she refused to accept that her voice did not matter. In 1941, she signed her name to a letter that accused a dictator of treason, knowing it could lead to arrest or worse. In 1961, she signed her name to a calling that the church said was not hers to claim, knowing it would lead to rejection and isolation. The cost was high both times. Grini took months of her life. The church took years. But the principle was identical. When you see injustice, you name it. When you are told to be silent, you speak. When you are told your signature does not count, you sign anyway. There is a photograph of Ingrid from 1961 taken just after her ordination. She stands outside Vang Church, her robe dark against the pale stone, her face calm but tired. If you look closely, you can see the faint lines around her eyes, lines carved by years of cold mornings in Grini, by sleepless nights wondering if the Gestapo would return, by long afternoons standing in pulpits where half the congregation wished she would disappear. She does not smile in the photograph. She does not need to. The envelope she once sealed with her thumb is gone, but the resolve is still there, written into every line of her face. How many other women stood in churches that refused them, signed letters that endangered them, and died without monuments?